The twin starships hung in the darkness of space like silver wounds against the black. Inside one of them, Ilara stood before the massive core engine, her pointed ears twitching as the vibrations ran through her body. She had built these drives with her bare hands and the help of Crimson and Azure, her two ancient dragons who now dwarfed the smallest hangar on this human vessel. 3 years ago, humanity had discovered that elf women possessed an unusual gift. Their connection to cosmic energy made them natural conduits for advanced technology. Ilara had been the first to volunteer, not for fame or money, but because her dragons needed fuel, and the humans offered something she could not refuse. They offered hope for a dying species. The captain of the Unity had found her on a frozen moon, where Ilara lived in exile with her dragons. She remembered his face, kind but determined. He told her that humanity faced extinction from a cosmic plague that consumed entire solar systems. They needed power unlike anything they had ever created. They needed magic and science combined. Ilara had said yes because she understood loss. Her entire civilization had fallen to the same plague centuries before. She knew what it meant to watch everything crumble. She could not let humanity experience that darkness. Her fingers glowed with pale blue light as she adjusted the frequency of the power core. Around her, humans in protective suits worked frantically, checking readings and making calculations. They had named her the quantum heart of their operation. Every ship that flew, every weapon that fired, every shield that protected a colony came from the energy she directed through these magnificent machines. The twin ships were different, though. These were experimental vessels designed for a mission too dangerous to risk with ordinary power supplies. They were meant to travel into the heart of the plague itself and plant a weapon that could stop it forever. The humans needed Ilara to make these ships move faster than anything had ever moved before. They needed her to push the limits of what was physically possible. Beside her, Crimson lifted his massive head. The red dragon had been with Ilara since she was barely old enough to walk. His scales reflected the blue glow of the power core, turning him into a living flame. He let out a low rumble that vibrated through the entire ship. Ilara understood his concern without words. They had bonded too long, too deeply. Dragons and elves knew each other's hearts. The captain entered the control room and everyone stood straighter. Diane was her name, and she commanded the respect of every person aboard through her quiet strength and unwavering belief in her crew. She had hair the color of iron and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. Captain Diane approached Ilara with a tablet in her hands. Her expression was troubled, and that worried Ilara more than any explosion ever could. The captain said that the government had discovered something new about Ilara's power. Every time she channeled energy through the core, she lost a small piece of herself. It was not dangerous yet, but eventually, if she continued, she would burn out completely. The humans had been lying about this risk all along, hoping Ilara would not ask too many questions. Ilara listened to these words and felt nothing but sadness. She had always known the truth deep down. Power always demanded a price. The universe did not reward heroes with happy endings and peaceful futures. That was human mythology, not reality. But then something unexpected happened. 2 humans stepped forward from the crowd. They introduced themselves as Elena and Olivia, scientists who had been studying Ilara's physiology since she arrived on the ship. They had a solution, something impossible but theoretically sound. They had been developing a technique that could anchor Ilara's essence to the quantum field itself, making her transfers less damaging to her core being. It would require 2 people to monitor the process constantly. It would require trust and vulnerability on Ilara's part. It would require her to lower her defenses completely and let these humans inside her mind and soul. Ilara looked at Crimson and Azure, her dragons who had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She looked at Captain Diane and saw the hope there, fragile but genuine. She looked at Elena and Olivia and saw only truth in their faces. She said yes without hesitation. The process took weeks to prepare. Ilara had to sit in meditation while Elena and Olivia worked with her consciousness, carefully weaving their intentions with her essence. Crimson and Azure watched from across the chamber, their ancient eyes tracking every movement, every breath. The dragons had lived long enough to recognize a moment of true significance, a turning point that would change everything that came after. When it was finished, Ilara felt different, but not diminished. She felt connected in new ways, expanded rather than reduced. She could feel Elena and Olivia inside her somehow, not as invasive presences but as protective threads woven through her consciousness. They had given her their strength to balance what the power core was taking. The bond between them became something beautiful and strong, something that science could not fully explain, but something that worked nonetheless. The twin ships launched on a day that burned with solar storms. Elara stood in the quantum chamber, her hands moving through patterns she had invented, drawing power from dimensions humans could not even perceive. The energy flowed through her body like rivers of light, and this time it did not hurt. This time she felt supported, held by the good intentions of two humans who had chosen to anchor themselves to her fate. Crimson and Azure sang their ancient songs, harmonizing with the hum of the engines. The dragons' voices were the oldest magic in the universe, and they lent their strength to Elara's work. The twin ships accelerated past the speed of light, then past the speed of thought, then into spaces where speed itself became meaningless. They carried a weapon that could save a species. They carried hope that refused to die, and they carried the strange bond that had grown between an elf woman, two dragons, two human scientists, and one captain with iron hair, who believed that impossible things could become real if enough people refused to accept defeat. Elara opened her mind to the vastness of space around her, feeling the pulse of the cosmos itself. She was no longer just one being. She was connected to everything around her, to the ships, to the dragons, to Elena and Olivia, to Captain Diane and the entire crew. The journey was beginning, and there would be no turning back from what they were about to face in the darkness ahead. The void between stars held dangers that no human had ever witnessed before. Elara felt the first wave of the plague before the sensors even picked it up. It came like a wave of wrong things, like reality itself was being corrupted and twisted into shapes that should not exist. She cried out without meaning to, and both dragons responded instantly. Crimson roared with a sound that shook the entire ship, while Azure's scales turned from their normal silver blue to a deep purple, a color that meant ancient magic was being called upon. Elena and Olivia rushed into the quantum chamber, their faces pale with concern. They could feel what Elara was experiencing through their connection to her, a shared awareness that was both beautiful and terrifying. Elena grabbed Elara's hand and squeezed it tight. Olivia placed her other hand on Elara's shoulder, and together they stood like that for a moment, drawing strength from each other. Captain Diane's voice came through the communication system, steady and calm. She asked Elara what was happening, whether she could still pilot the ships, whether they needed to turn back. Elara shook her head, forgetting that the captain could not see her. She opened her mouth and spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind. She said that the plague was more terrible than anyone had imagined. It did not just consume matter and energy. It consumed meaning itself, eating away at the fundamental structure of reality. The weapon they carried was good, but it would not be enough. They would need to do something more, something that had never been done before. They would need to create a new kind of barrier, one made not from technology but from pure will and intention and love. Captain Diane was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that would echo through Elara's memory for the rest of her days. She said that if that was what needed to be done, then that was what they would do. No crew under her command had ever refused an impossible task, and she would not start now. Elara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that spread through her entire body. This was why she had said yes to the humans. This was why she had left the safety of her frozen moon. Because humanity, for all their limitations and their short lifespans and their desperate struggle against the darkness, had something beautiful inside them. They had the courage to look at the impossible and refuse to surrender. The journey took them deeper into the plague zone, where the stars were dying and the light was fading. Elara worked constantly at the power core, pushing herself further than she had ever pushed before. Elena and Olivia took turns sitting with her, offering their presence and their strength. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories of their lives before the unity, of the families they had left behind on Earth, of the dreams they had always wanted to accomplish. Sometimes they sat in silence, just breathing together, three separate beings bound by something that transcended words. Crimson and Azure had moved into the quantum chamber as well, unable to bear being separated from Elara during this crucial time. The dragons curled around the space in a protective circle, their massive bodies a comfort and an anchor. Azure began to weave patterns with her magic, creating glowing symbols in the air that pulsed with ancient power. Crimson added his own fire to the pattern, and the two dragons' magic intertwined into something that resembled a prayer, a calling out into the darkness for help and guidance. Days turned into weeks in the quantum chamber. The crew of the twin ships worked to keep Alara fed and hydrated, while she maintained the constant flow of power that kept them moving forward into the heart of the plague. There were moments when Alara's consciousness expanded so far that she could feel the presence of other civilizations that had been consumed by the plague. She felt their last moments, their final acts of resistance before the darkness claimed them. Some of them had families. Some of them had dreams. Some of them had loved each other deeply, and all of them had disappeared, erased from the universe as though they had never existed at all. It would have been easy to despair, to simply give up and let the darkness take her as it had taken so many others. But every time that darkness crept too close, Alara felt Elena and Olivia's presence in her mind. She felt the ancient magic of crimson and azure. She felt the steady determination of Captain Diane and the brave crew that worked day and night to keep the ships functioning. She felt the weight of human hope and elf magic and dragon determination, all woven together into something unbreakable. They reached the designated zone, the place where they would plant the weapon, but even before they could prepare to launch it, something happened that none of them had anticipated. The plague itself seemed to notice them, to become aware of their presence. A wave of corruption erupted from the darkness, a living thing that moved with hunger and malice. It struck the first twin ship like a physical force, and alarms began to wail throughout the vessel. Captain Diane's voice was steady as she gave orders, evacuating non-essential personnel from the impact zone, diverting power to the shields, preparing for a second wave of attacks. But Alara knew the shields would not hold. The plague was too strong, too vast, too fundamentally opposed to everything that was right and good. She made a decision in that moment, a choice that would either save them all or destroy her completely. Alara stood up from her seat at the power core. Elena and Olivia looked at her with sudden fear, sensing what she was about to do. Alara told them that she was going to bridge the gap between ships herself, that she was going to create a connection that would allow her to defend both vessels simultaneously. It would be dangerous. It would hurt. She did not know if she would survive it, but it was the only way. Elena and Olivia both spoke at once, begging her not to do this, insisting that they had just learned how to protect her from the worst of the power drain. But Alara smiled at them, and in that smile was gratitude and love and the understanding that some things were worth the risk. She told them to trust her, to maintain the connection between them no matter what happened next. She told them that even if her body failed, her will would not. And she told them that they had changed her, that they had shown her that sacrifice did not have to be lonely, that there could be beauty in the act of giving everything to save those you loved. Alara raised her hands, and the power core flared to life with a brightness that burned like a second sun. Her body glowed with blue light, her pointed ears seeming to point toward some distant heaven. Crimson and azure added their voices to the energy, their ancient magic amplifying what Alara was doing. The connection between the two ships became visible as threads of pure light spanning the void between them, and in those threads was written the combined will of an elf woman, 2 dragons, 2 human scientists, and 1 human captain who had believed in the impossible. The light that emanated from Alara's body was not like any light that humans had ever seen before. It was warm and cold at the same time, alive and conscious, moving with intention and purpose. The threads of connection between the two ships grew thicker and brighter, and they began to pulse with a rhythm that matched Alara's heartbeat. Everyone aboard both vessels felt it at the same time, a sense of protection that went beyond anything that shields or weapons could provide. They were being held safe inside the love and determination of someone who had chosen to stand against the darkness alone if necessary. Captain Diane made a decision in that moment. She contacted every crew member on both ships and told them to redirect all their hope and energy toward one single purpose. She told them to hold the image of home in their minds, to think about the people they loved on Earth, to remember the blue oceans and green forests and the feeling of rain on their skin. She told them that their thoughts and feelings would reach Alara, that they would strengthen her, that together they would not fail. The crew responded instantly, and throughout both ships thousands of human minds focused on a single intention: They sent thoughts of love and determination and hope into the quantum channel that connected them to Alara. Elena and Olivia could feel the collective consciousness reaching Alara, feeding her, sustaining her as the plague attacked again and again against the barrier she had created. They held her hands tighter, pouring every ounce of their own will into the connection between them. Olivia began to speak, her voice soft but steady. She told Alara stories about her childhood, about the time she fell from a tree and broke her arm but got back up and climbed it again the next day. Elena added her own story, about failing her entrance exams for university but studying harder and getting in on the second attempt. They spoke of human resilience, of the ability to stand up every time you fall, of the refusal to surrender no matter how difficult things became. Crimson and Azure moved even closer to Alara, their massive bodies creating a physical circle of protection around her. The Red Dragon began to sing a song that was older than human civilization, older even than the plague itself. It was a song of defiance, of the power of smaller beings standing together against vastness and darkness. Azure joined her voice to his, and their combined song became a force in itself, something that the plague could not consume or corrupt because it was rooted in magic so ancient and pure that it existed in dimensions the plague could not even reach. The creature of corruption launched a massive attack, a wave of wrongness that threatened to break through the barrier completely. But just as it reached the barrier, something extraordinary happened. Throughout the twin ships, the crew began to sing. Humans do not have the magic of dragons or the connection to the cosmic forces that elves possess, but they have something else. They have the power to come together, to amplify each other's voices, to create harmony from discord. They sang together, thousands of voices joining in a song of hope and defiance and the belief that their small lives mattered in the face of overwhelming darkness. The combined force of elf magic, dragon song, and human hope created something new, something that the plague had never encountered before in its long existence, consuming civilizations. It created a barrier not made of technology or power or strength alone, but made of collective will, of consciousness joined together, of the fundamental human and elf and dragon capacity to care about each other enough to stand against the end of all things. The plague recoiled, screaming in a voice that was felt rather than heard, a sound that echoed through dimensions humans could not perceive. But Alara knew that this barrier would not hold forever. The plague was too vast, too ancient, too determined. They had bought time, perhaps hours or days, but eventually the plague would break through again. They had to get to the weapon launch site and activate the device before their defenses failed. Through the connection between them, Alara communicated this to Elena and Olivia, and they in turn communicated it to Captain Diane. The captain gave new orders, and the twin ships began to move forward even faster, racing toward their destination while Alara maintained the barrier that held the plague at bay. The journey became a blur of effort and exhaustion. Alara's body was burning from the inside out, energy flowing through her faster than it was ever meant to flow. Elena and Olivia could feel her pain through their connection, and they wept even as they kept their hands on her shoulders, kept their voices steady with words of encouragement and love. They told her stories of things that made them laugh, of moments that had brought them joy, of reasons to live and fight and refuse to give up. They painted pictures with their words of futures that could exist if they succeeded, of the people they would save, of the children who would be born and grow up in a universe without the plague. Crimson moved his massive head until it was right beside Alara's. The dragon's ancient eyes looked directly into her eyes, and a memory passed between them. It was a memory of the day they had bonded, when Alara was just a small elf child and Crimson was just a hatchling dragon. They had been afraid together in the darkness, two lonely beings who had found each other and realized that they no longer had to face the world alone. That memory flowed between them now, reminding Alara of all the years they had shared, all the struggles they had overcome together, all the reasons why giving up was not an option. Azure joined her voice to the memory, adding to it her own experiences with Alara, the moments of joy and hardship, the times when they had laughed together and the times when they had grieved together. The dragon's memories were older and deeper than human memories, reaching back through centuries to a time when the world was younger and magic was still new. They offered all of that history to Alara, all of that accumulated power and experience and love. The communication system crackled with Captain Diane's voice. She said that they were approaching the weapon launch site. She said that they could see the center of the plague zone ahead. a swirling maelstrom of darkness and corruption that seemed to defy description. She asked Alara if she could feel it, and Alara responded that yes, she could feel it. It was like standing at the edge of a void that was alive and aware and hungry. It was the most terrible thing she had ever sensed, but she was not afraid anymore, because she was not standing at that edge alone. She had Elena and Olivia beside her. She had her dragons wrapped around her. She had thousands of human voices singing together, all of them determined to stop this darkness from consuming anyone else. The twin ships began to slow their approach, moving carefully now toward the heart of the plague. Alara adjusted her power output, shifting from defense to something new, something that would allow them to plant the weapon even as the plague tried to stop them. She was ready. They were all ready, and the final confrontation with the darkness was about to begin. The weapon launch bay was a marvel of human and elf engineering combined. Inside the specially shielded chamber, a device sat waiting, pulsing with its own internal power. It had taken the combined minds of dozens of the greatest scientists and engineers that humanity had to offer to create this weapon. It was designed to restore reality itself, to heal the fundamental corruption that the plague had inflicted on existence. But it could only work if it was detonated at the exact center of the plague zone, in the heart of the darkness itself. Captain Diane stood in the command center, watching the sensors as the twin ships drew closer to that terrible center. She could see on the displays how the fabric of reality was twisted and broken in that region. Space and time seemed to flow wrong, moving in directions that the human mind could barely comprehend. The weapon would be launched in a pod that could only move so far under its own power, before it would need to be guided the rest of the way. And the only way to guide it through those twisted regions was with a consciousness that was not bound by normal human limitations. It would need an elf, someone with the ability to perceive and navigate through dimensions that human senses could not reach. It would need Alara. Alara already knew what was being asked of her before Captain Diane sent the official request through the communication system. She could feel it in the hesitation of the captain's thoughts, in the guilt that Elena and Olivia were desperately trying to hide through their connection to her. They did not want to ask this of her. They did not want to send her consciousness so far from her body that there was a real possibility she might not be able to find her way back. But there was no one else who could do it. There was no one else who had the knowledge or the power, or the unique connection to both human science and ancient magic that would be required for this task. Alara told them yes before they could even finish formulating the request. Elena and Olivia cried out in protest through their bond, but Alara was gentle with them. She explained that this was not sacrifice in the way they feared it. This was something else, something more beautiful and more profound. She said that if she succeeded in guiding the weapon to its target, she would be returning a universe to countless species that had never even known the plague existed. She would be giving children born centuries from now the chance to exist in a cosmos that was whole and healthy and free from that ancient corruption. Crimson and Azure understood immediately. The dragons had lived long enough to know when a moment of true significance had arrived, when a single action could echo through eternity. They moved even closer to Alara, their bodies providing comfort and strength. Crimson pressed his massive forehead against Alara's, and in that contact, ancient memories flowed between them. The dragon showed Alara the moment when the plague had first begun to consume the elf civilization, the desperate final stand that her ancestors had made. The moment when they had realized that some battles must be lost, so that future battles could be won. It was a memory of heartbreak, but also of nobility and purpose. Azure added her own memories, showing Alara the dragon civilizations that had been consumed by the plague in ages past, the sacrifices that dragons had made to give their younger generations a chance to flee and hide and survive. She showed Alara that what she was about to do was not unprecedented, that beings far greater and older than her had already walked this path. And some of them had succeeded, had found their way back to their bodies, had lived to see the consequences of their courage ripple outward through time. Elena and Olivia held Alara's hands so tightly that their knuckles went white. They asked her if she was afraid, and Alara answered honestly. Yes, she was afraid. Fear was appropriate for a task this dangerous and this important, but fear did not have to paralyze you, or stop you from doing what needed to be done. Alara told them that the three of them had forged a bond that transcended normal human and elf understanding. She said that no matter how far her consciousness traveled, she would be able to feel them anchored in the base reality, holding a connection to her, keeping a doorway open for her to find her way back. The weapon was prepared and loaded into its launch pod. The entire crew of both ships gathered in observation areas, knowing that they were about to witness something that would either save or doom them all. Captain Diane stood in the command center with her hands clasped behind her back, her iron-colored hair catching the light from dozens of monitors. She sent a message to Alara that was simple and direct. She said that everyone on both ships was proud to serve alongside her, that her courage was an inspiration that would be remembered forever, that humanity would never forget what she was doing for them. The moment of launch arrived. Alara released most of her consciousness from her body, allowing it to expand and stretch until she could perceive the multi-dimensional pathways that existed between normal space. Elena and Olivia stayed connected to her, providing an anchor point that kept her from dissipating completely into those strange spaces. Crimson and Azure added their power to the connection, creating a lifeline that stretched between Ilara's body and her traveling consciousness. The weapon pod launched with a blast of force that shook both ships. Ilara's consciousness wrapped around it like an invisible hand, guiding it through the twisted regions of space that had been corrupted by the plague. She could feel the plague trying to stop her, trying to pull her consciousness into itself, trying to absorb her into its vast and ancient hunger. But every time the darkness tried to claim her, she felt Elena and Olivia pulling her back, reminding her of who she was and where she came from. She felt Crimson and Azure lending their ancient power to her struggle, remembered everything that her dragons had shown her about previous victories against impossible odds. The weapon drew closer to the center of the plague zone, closer to the source of all the corruption. Ilara could feel something there, something vast and ancient and aware. It was not just a disease or a natural disaster. It was something that had consciousness, something that had existed since before most civilizations had been born. It was the primal force of entropy itself, given shape and hunger and malice by circumstances lost to the depths of time. It noticed Ilara's consciousness and turned its attention toward her. The pressure was immense, like standing at the bottom of an ocean while every atom of water pressed down with infinite weight. Ilara could have retreated in that moment. She could have abandoned the mission and retreated back to her body in safety. But she thought of all the civilizations that the plague had consumed. She thought of all the species that would never exist because they had been erased from reality. She thought of the future that Elena and Olivia dreamed of. A future where humans could explore the cosmos safely and build great things and create beautiful lives free from fear. She pushed the weapon pod closer to the center, closer to her destiny, closer to the moment when everything would either transform or be lost forever. The weapon pod reached the center of the plague zone and began its detonation sequence. The blast that erupted was not like any explosion that humans had ever created before. It was not fire or heat or kinetic force. It was pure reality, a wave of correct and healthy and whole existence that rippled outward from the center like a stone dropped into water. The plague screamed in a voice that transcended sound, a scream of every atom of the entity being torn apart and restored to its proper place in the cosmic order. Ilara felt the wave coming toward her and did not flee. Instead, she opened herself completely to it, letting it pour through her consciousness, using her own being as a channel through which the healing could flow. The pain was beyond anything she had ever experienced, but there was beauty in it too. She could feel the universe being repaired, could feel civilizations that had been erased blinking back into existence, could feel the fundamental wrongness being stripped away and replaced with fundamental rightness. Elena and Olivia felt the wave pass through their connection to Ilara, and they nearly lost their grip on her. The force of it was almost too much to withstand, but they held on with everything they had, even as their bodies convulsed and their minds screamed with the effort of maintaining the connection. Crimson and Azure roared with voices that shook the foundations of the ship, adding their power to the lifeline they were extending to Ilara. They held her, consciousness anchored to her body, even as that consciousness was being transformed. By the healing wave that was spreading across the cosmos, the plague was dying. The vast ancient entity that had consumed so many civilizations was being unmade, its consciousness dissolving back into the quantum foam from which all things ultimately come. It died screaming, and in its final moments it pulled at everything around it, trying to drag reality down into the void with it. The twin ships shook violently as the fabric of space around them buckled and twisted. Captain Diane gripped the sides of her command chair, and gave orders to the crew to hold position, to maintain their connection to Alara no matter what happened around them. But something was wrong. The weapon had worked perfectly, had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. The plague was being destroyed, the universe was being healed, but Alara was not coming back. Her consciousness had been scattered so far and transformed so completely that she could not find her way through the dimensional channels back to her body. She was lost somewhere in the spaces between spaces, dispersed across the quantum foam of reality itself. Elena and Olivia felt her slipping away, felt her consciousness beginning to dissolve into the fundamental chaos that existed at the base level of all creation. They did the only thing they could think of to do. They opened their minds completely and poured everything of themselves into that quantum space, their own consciousness following after Alara's, determined not to let her be lost in the vastness of what lay beyond normal reality. It was an act of supreme courage and supreme foolishness, but it was also an act of absolute love. Crimson and Azure felt what the two human women had done, and they knew that their own end was approaching. The dragons had lived for centuries, had seen empires rise and fall, had survived catastrophes that would have erased lesser beings, but they had never been called upon to perform a task like this. They began to sing, and their song was a prayer and a bridge and a rope cast into the darkness. They sang Elena and Olivia's consciousness into harmony with Alara's, creating a pattern that could be perceived and recognized in the chaos of the quantum space. They sang, and their voices grew weaker as they poured their life force into the song, but still they did not stop. In the chaos beyond reality, something remarkable happened. Three consciousnesses that should have been torn apart and scattered came together and formed something new. The two human women and the elf woman were no longer separate beings joined by a connection. They had become something unified, something that existed as one consciousness with three perspectives. They could think thoughts that were more complex than any single mind could conceive. They could perceive dimensional spaces that should have been invisible and unknowable, and together, they could find their way back. The path through the dimensional channels that had seemed impossible for one consciousness to navigate became clear when three minds worked in harmony. They moved through quantum foam and folded space, following the song that Crimson and Azure were still singing despite their exhaustion. The dragons were dying as they sang, their ancient forms using up their final reserves of life force to keep the pathway illuminated. But they did not stop and did not falter. They sang until their last breath had been spent, and then they sang a little more, and then they were gone. But the song remained in the quantum space itself, immortalized as part of the fundamental structure of the healed universe. Elena, Olivia, and Alara returned to their bodies simultaneously, gasping as if they had been drowning. Alara's body convulsed on the ground of the quantum chamber, her eyes going wide as she tried to process being human and elf and human again after having been unified with two other consciousnesses. Elena and Olivia collapsed beside her, and for several long moments none of them could do anything but breathe and cry and try to understand what they had just experienced. Captain Diane rushed into the chamber with medical personnel. She looked at the empty spaces where Crimson and Azure had been, and for a moment her usually composed expression crumpled with grief. She understood immediately what had happened, what the dragons had done to bring their friends back to them. She knelt beside the three women and spoke words of gratitude, tears running down her iron-gray face. She told them that they had saved not just humanity, but entire civilizations across the cosmos, that they had done something that would be remembered forever, that their courage and sacrifice had brought hope back to a universe that had been drowning in darkness. The twin ships began the journey home. Behind them, the plague zone was now healing naturally, reality restoring itself to wholeness. The weapon had worked perfectly, and its effects were spreading outward at the speed of light itself. Every moment that passed, more systems were being restored, more species were being saved, more futures were becoming possible because the ancient corruption had been erased. Alara, Elena, and Olivia lay in the medical bay, recovering from the ordeal that had transformed them. They were still connected to each other on a level beyond normal understanding. They could sense each other's thoughts and feelings with a clarity that was sometimes overwhelming. They would never be entirely separate beings again, Part of them had merged in that space beyond reality and had never completely separated. They were a trinity, 3 souls bound so completely that they thought sometimes with 1 mind and 3 bodies. They held hands in the medical bay and looked at the memorial that Captain Diane had set up in the corner, a place of honor where the names of Crimson and Azure were inscribed alongside a message that they had died to save the universe itself. The stars ahead of them looked brighter than they had before. Hope had returned to the cosmos, and aboard the twin ships 3 women who had been forever changed by their journey held on to each other and knew that they had made the right choice, that sacrifice had not defeated them, but had instead revealed the true measure of who they were and what they were capable of becoming when they refused to surrender to darkness.